It was a few years back. I was home alone with my daughter, who was basically a newborn. She was asleep in her bassinet beside my bed. I was in an old house alone, as my ex-husband was working nights at the time. My bedroom was on the second floor. It was around midnight when I woke up to give my daughter a bottle. As she settled back to sleep, I laid in bed scrolling on my phone, trying to get myself tired again. I'm cautious about believing things people post on Facebook without sources, but I'd noticed that a few people had made the same post, and I came across an article stating that there was a murderer on the run. He had killed a man in the next town over from me, and was now running from police. It said they were advising people to stay inside, lock their doors, and some even received phone calls as well. Now, stuff like this was a very rare happening around where I lived. So of course, I was freaked out. I texted my ex-husband at work, who had a hard time believing this story. He told me to keep my police scanner on at night. I fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I was asleep for, but suddenly I was woken up by officers on the scanner screaming, "Shots fired!" I had a hard time distinguishing what I was hearing on my phone and what was going on outside. The rapid gunfire started and sounded like it was right in the street just outside my window. It took me a moment to register the noise as shots to my virgin ears. All of a sudden, it was like time suddenly slowed down as I rolled off my bed and grabbed my daughter tight. I remember running into the hallway in what seemed like slow motion, blurry tunnel vision with her away from all the windows, screaming what the fuck is happening in my head. I shakily dialed my ex-husband at work, and he still wasn't really believing what was going on, so I yelled and called my mom instead. I just wanted someone to talk to, so I didn't feel so alone and scared. I kept telling her there was shooting outside and I was sobbing, so maybe she didn't understand me in her half-awoken state of mind. I don't even remember what happened after she realized what I was saying, because suddenly I was hanging up and putting my phone on the floor. I stayed in the hallway for I don't know how long, clutching my still sleeping baby, who had somehow managed to rest through all of this chaos. My body was in vibrate mode. Sometime later, my phone was ringing. It was my mom. I could barely focus enough to listen, but I thought she told me she was coming over, so I told her to stay home or she was safe instead. She was yelling at me that she was already on the road, but the police had completely blocked it off. Turned out they had shot the suspect and he was already dead. When my mom came up to the front porch, we saw wet, muddy footprints coming up the steps and smeared on the door, like he had kicked it or something. I'm wondering if maybe that's what woke me up at first. By the time my mom got to my house and came inside, it was 5 a.m. It was winter, so it was still pitch black dark outside. We sat quietly in the bright kitchen, tiredly sipping coffee and passing my daughter back and forth to each other. My ex-husband arrived home shortly after and believed everything once he saw all the cops and the road blocked off as well. Long story short, this man had killed someone in the next town over from me, about 3 to 5 minutes away. He ran to my town, through my backyard, to the road through the trees, and killed another person in the house in back of me. That's when the cops showed up and he began to shoot at them, so they all shot him at once. That was all the gunfire I'd heard. He laid there dead in the measly patch of woods in the back of my house. I had goosebumps thinking about all of this murder taking place right next to me as I lay there in bed. When my mom left and my ex-husband put our daughter back to sleep, I stepped outside onto the back porch to smoke a cigarette. 8 months smoke-free. I stood there smoking and watching all the lights, a stark contrast against the early gray morning. It was cold. That afternoon, I ended up having to block multiple news reporters for harassing me to tell my story. I told them I had no problem with doing so in more detail, but I did not want to be on television. I had not slept since and had my daughter with me as well. They said they wanted to catch her on camera too. After denying them, they kept asking if I was at work and if they could come to my work to do the interview instead. So I ended up blocking everyone and tried to move on with my life. So right off, I'm not going to lie. I basically went to college to smoke weed and go to parties. My full intention was to do just enough to get by, while partying as much as I could. Unfortunately for me, I only applied to a few schools because of this, and was only accepted to one, a small college in the mountains of New Hampshire. It was a very small college as well. Around 3,500 total undergrads, and I went there not knowing anyone. On the first day, as I was skipping the ice-breaking games and other students were giving tours of the campus to their families before leaving, I wandered down a small path behind the cafeteria toward a small stream I had noticed during the drive-in. I lit up a joint and was just meandering around when I noticed another dude a little further down the stream that cut a straightish path through the trees. He was also smoking a joint, I assumed, by the way he was holding it. I made my way over to see if I'd just made my first college friend, and introduced myself readily. His name was Nate, and he seemed very cool. He was smoking some real nice herbs, so I figured I would get along with him just fine. He stood about 5'5" and was a little bit stubby. I remember noticing he had this really weird laugh, like a very nervous type. Whenever he laughed too, he'd kinda look off to the side, then glance back at me from his peripheral vision. Yes, I knew this was weird even back then, from the very first time I met him, literally within the first 30 seconds of introducing myself. At the time though, I thought he was just socially awkward. Maybe he had bad teeth or something, who knows. I was taught not to judge, and he was otherwise pretty normal. We ended up hanging out fairly frequently, playing video games, drinking, smoking, but other people, especially in my dorm, didn't really seem to take a liking to him. Not that I really felt I had a strong bond with him either. I really didn't. It was a very superficial friendship built around drugs and debauchery. But I definitely got the sense that any other friends I made weren't very comfortable around him. Then something weird happened that I managed to successfully forget about until fairly recently. My heart is pumping out of my chest even just typing about it. So one weekend, my roommate was home for a visit, and Nate's roommate was having his girlfriend over, which basically implied in college terms that Nate was going to be staying with me. It seemed almost automatic. We got trashed, smoked a ton, grabbed some pizza, played some video games. I was pretty out of it by that point, and we were both sitting in desk chairs in my room, passing a bowl back and forth. He handed one to me, leaning toward me in his chair, put his hand over mine casually, and in a low, steady voice said, "I'm going to fucking kill you." Okay, so like I said before, we were all kinds of messed up, but I was definitely freaked out a little inside. He had never been aggressive before, even at his most intoxicated. Certainly he'd never said anything like that. I've never been the type to handle confrontation very well, so all I could manage was a simple, "No, dude, don't do that, bro." I sorta laughed it off and tried to write it off as a drunk, stoned idiot playing too much Mortal Kombat. We had a bunk bed set up in the room since it was pretty small. I was on the top since my roommate was a bigger guy and didn't want to have to climb down on top of me to pee in the middle of the night. We had both gone to bed, but my roommate had put up Christmas lights that we always just kept on, strung along the ceiling. I'm half deaf, I should add, so when I sleep I tend to roll onto my functioning ear to block out the sounds or muffle them in the pillow. This also means I tend to be a pretty heavy sleeper. Sometime during the night I woke up, feeling a little bit nauseous, and slowly opened my eyes. Nate was fucking standing on the edge of his mattress, holding onto the side railings of my top bunk, and staring directly at my face as I was sleeping. What the fuck? My eyes snapped wide open, and I sat up immediately. "What the fuck are you doing, dude?" I said, backing up and bumping my head on the wall behind me. Then he turned his head and gave me that same look from the corners of his eyes, that same smile and laugh that freaked me out the very first day I met him. He was still holding the railings, standing on the mattress from the lower bunk. His face was lit in weird splashes of color from the Christmas lights. He took one hand from the railing and put his finger to his mouth while smiling, looking at me sideways, and whispered, "Shh," before hopping down and leaving the room. It was 3 a.m., and I don't know where he went that night. I never told anyone about that, and pretty much did my best to bury it and never think about it again. I avoided Nate for the rest of the year as well, making up excuses whenever he wanted to chill alone, but we did end up at the same parties sometimes. We never talked about that, and he never brought it up again either. I transferred to another school the following year, not because of Nate or anything, just general financial reasons. Eventually, I did manage to forget all about that weird incident. That was 15 years ago. I'm 33 now, and recently got a call from my old roommate from school in New Hampshire, who remembered my very repetitive phone number. I actually made a song out of it since it was so easy to remember, and I never really bothered to change the number. "Hey man, you remember that guy Nate you used to hang out with at the dorms? He killed 2 of his friends with a hunting knife and a fishing line on a camping trip a year ago. Said he was too fucked up to control himself. He was fixing his meds with booze and drugs. They say he just lost it. The thing that fucks with me is wondering if he told them he was going to kill them too, and if the last thing they saw was that sideways smile that I saw when I woke up that night." So, I've kind of been wanting to post this for a while, but a combination of technical difficulties and residual fear have prevented me from doing so thus far. Now though, it's the middle of the night and I've got nothing better to do, so I'm going to finally get this off my chest. I grew up with parents who were reasonable, loving people, but more than a little bit paranoid when it came to the internet. Anything that allowed anonymous communication in any form was banned, point blank from the household. Even Club Penguin wasn't allowed because you could chat in it. Naturally, when I got my first laptop at 12 years old, a junk piece of crap gotten only because all my homework that year was online, the very first thing I did was start trying to talk to people online. I mean, I wasn't hopping in random chat rooms or anything because my parents' warnings did resonate with me, but I wasn't avoiding all contact either. Instead, I ended up making a DeviantArt account. I know, cringe. I didn't do very much posting, as I lacked artistic talent. In spite of this, however, I was contacted via private message by a guy who I'll call Joker, because his profile picture was of the Joker. Maybe that should have been a warning sign in and of itself, honestly. Joker just started talking to me out of the blue. I think I'd commented on one of his pieces or something, and he reached out to me to thank me for my kind words. From there, we started talking. As it turned out, we actually had a lot of common interests. We played some of the same games, liked the same cartoons, and he seemed like a really nice guy. I think it was maybe a week or 2 in that the first uncomfortable thing happened, even if I didn't exactly think much of it at the time. The 2 of us shared a somewhat misanthropic view of the world, so there were a lot of dark jokes passed back and forth between us. Sometime about a week after we first started messaging, he casually mentioned thinking that the world would be better off without him. I sent him a sad face and assured him that it would not, as I quite liked talking to him. He didn't say anything more about it then, so I assumed that would be it. Of course, it wasn't. Joker talked about suicide a lot. As in, his talking about it quickly morphed from passing commentary to long graphic rants about how much he hated himself and wanted to die and what method would be best for him to do so. I spent hours talking him down over chat, terrified that one day I wouldn't be able to say enough and he'd actually go through with it. Eventually, though, his messages started getting creepy in an entirely different way. It started with him telling me how grateful he was to have me, how no one had ever cared as much about him as I did, how important I was to him, how he couldn't ever live without me now, how he'd just die if he were to ever lose me, and he began to get obsessed. One day, a couple months into this, my laptop broke. It wasn't too bad, but it still took a couple of days before everything was back in working order. I logged back into DeviantArt, only to find dozens of messages, all from Joker. They started off normal enough, but very quickly became frantic after I didn't initially respond. The last message he had sent was along the lines of, "I can't take this anymore," followed by a link to a picture image. The image was a pair of slit wrists. The cuts were deep and fresh-looking too, with red inflamed edges. The beginnings of an ugly scabbing just beginning to settle over the top. I was horrified. I quickly messaged him back, terrified I'd just lost a friend, and he responded very quickly. "I thought I'd lost you," he said. "I thought you'd left me. I couldn't handle the pain without you. Don't ever do that to me again." I said I wouldn't, and he seemed relieved. He only got even worse from then on. It reached a point where practically every hour of our every conversation consisted of him either professing his obsession with me, threatening suicide, or both. The stress was starting to keep me up at night. I was terrified that one day soon I'd open the chat and never see anything again. I was utterly convinced it was my job to keep this guy alive, and I was obviously failing miserably at it. Joker kept on escalating, until one day, nearly a year in, he finally said something that frightened me so badly, I had no choice but to leave. He started talking about how I was the only good person left on this miserable planet. He waxed poetic about how much he wanted to kill himself, and said he'd finally found a way to truly be happy. The only way he'd ever be able to find happiness was through killing himself and taking me with him. That way we could always be together, free from the cruel weight of the world. He started going into very detailed, very graphic plans of how he was going to kill me. Quite a few of them involved carving out my heart, clutching it to his chest and laying beside me as he took his own life too. I was terrified, enough so that I did what I should have done a long time ago and deleted that account. For years following that incident, I never spoke to a single person online. Even to this day, actually, there's still a lingering sense of dread when it comes to online interaction. So, to the boy who I thought was my first internet friend, I don't know what your deal was, whether you were mentally ill or purposefully malicious, or maybe a combination of the two. But whatever the case is, I hope you've gotten the help you clearly needed, and I never want to see you again. So, when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was about 5'3" and 95 pounds as well. I was at the park just down the street from my house, waiting for the school bus to arrive. Usually my boyfriend who had just graduated would drive me to school, but he was busy that day. I later found out he was out cheating instead. Well, there was usually at least a few of us girls there waiting, so normally I'd be safe. But this day I was the only one there. So I sat at a bench and had one headphone in and one out so I could pay attention to my surroundings. I'd always been cautious of what was going on around me. Well, as I waited there on that bench, a black Honda suddenly pulled up and I immediately noticed it. I kept a close eye on it because I had a bad feeling right away. I wasn't making it too obvious that I was watching though, because I didn't want to look crazy. But after only a few minutes, two huge men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park, and these guys were creeping me out. Of course, he didn't text me back, so I copy-pasted the same text to my cousin who was home. At the time, I lived with my aunt and two guy cousins. Unwinding down from the night shift, I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus it was two men. Didn't get a response from them either. Right as the men got out of their car, they started to walk toward me. I got up from the bench and walked toward the street because the bus was supposed to arrive there any minute. The driver actually ended up being a little bit late that day. As I stood by the street, these men walked up to me and I could immediately feel the bad energy. One guy said hello, as the other one stood there staring me down. I just did a small smile and nod and looked away. Then, the same guy, I'll call him number 1, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number 2, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. Then number 1 kept asking me yes or no questions. Do you have a boyfriend? Do you live close? Do you do drugs? We have some if you want them. Then number 2 asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush over my body, and I got the chills. Number 2, who was quiet the whole time, started to tell me they'd just gotten back from Russia, but the way he said it was so scary, so intimidating. I knew they were from somewhere else because they had strong accents, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. They kept telling me to go to their car because they had drugs on them. I said no thank you, of course. Trust me, I was not a straight edge in high school, but I was not that stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I did not know. Number 1 then asked if I had a car myself. I said no, and that my bus was almost here and I had to go. By some miracle of the universe, the bus rounded the corner at exactly that moment, and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they asked me questions. Before the bus got to me though, number 1 handed me a card and said he had a car shop and to call him sometime if I ever needed anything. He even told me he'd give me a free car. The card looked extremely shifty and I didn't even want to touch it, but I knew I'd need that number to report it. I took it and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and picked me up. As soon as I got on, I started to cry. I had a complete meltdown. It was like all of the adrenaline that was keeping my mind and body aware and focused while the men were there immediately washed away as soon as I was safe. My body and mind gave out. Thankfully, there weren't many people on the bus with me, so the driver calmed me down before we took off, and I explained to her what happened. When she looked around for the car, they were long gone. She said she'd seen them around me but thought I knew them because they were so close to my person. The driver called into her dispatch saying there was an incident so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick up all of the other students, but when we got to the school, she walked with me into the office. I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did campus security. They were so sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the 2 guys, their car, what type of questions they asked me. I cried nearly the entire time. Then I pulled out the card the guy gave me and handed it to the principal. He looked at the security guard and said he was going to call it and act like my dad. So that's what he did. He put it on speaker and number 1 answered. I knew his voice as if it was seared into my brain. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack right then. The principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price, and the guy played dumb. The principal said his daughter, me, gave him the card. As soon as he said that, the guy hung up. They tried calling again, but this time the phone was shut off, then eventually disconnected altogether. I could see a shift in the principal and security as soon as the phone clicked. The security guard got on his phone and called the police and had them come out to the school. It was as if they finally knew it was real. My crazy story wasn't just made up. The principal excused himself and the security guard, and they talked outside for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything they were saying, though. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come get her right now. When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in and asked me for the story again in front of the principal and security guard. I felt like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me. They told me it sounded like they were watching us girls at the park because they chose that one day when one of us was alone. He also said the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they wanted. I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that did was my boyfriend. One of the officers talked to him, and the other finally got a hold of my aunt after a while. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, aunt, mom, and cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears, and the men were livid, but they were all worried for me. A week later, some girl at another local high school was saved by other students. She was being dragged into a black Honda by two guys. The other kids thankfully saw and grabbed her and pulled her out of their car. The principal called me into his office, and that's how I figured it out. They also had the same officers there, and had me choose the two guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out so fast. They were caught, of course. It was in fact those two guys that tried grabbing that girl, only a freshman. I felt worried for her, and sad she'd gone through worse than I did. And I almost felt free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulder as often. I couldn't believe they actually managed to catch them. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year, and my boyfriend, now ex of course, also took me some days. I'm just thankful to be alive and well, and I'm even more thankful that that other girl was saved by those courageous kids at her high school. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on the Great American Road Trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging throughout the country for 6 weeks or so. We were both in our early 20s at the time and pretty broke. As my mom had been a long-haul trucker, I suggested that to save a ton of money, we could sleep in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup actually. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut one of them up to make some curtains. By the end of the first week, we'd gotten so good at setting up camp we could do it in about 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains up, laid down, and out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, basically anywhere it seemed safe and at least semi-legal. There was never really a night, after the first at least, where we felt scared. Until the last week of the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and had gotten pretty used to our routine at that point. We didn't go on a set schedule and would never drive more than 3 or 4 hours a day. No destination particularly in mind outside of a few must-see landmarks. We'd just drive to places we found the night before on Google and take some suggestions from other campers we'd met on the way. Locals and other people too. We'd also gotten very good at making friends in that time. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks we'd met at a campsite in the back of their pickup because I got hungry and overheard them saying they were going to go. We met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar. Hope you're still kicking around, Grandpa Mac. And played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a big thunderstorm. We got fed breakfast and dinner by tons of campers who invited us to hang out with them, spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite, and basically every encounter we had with a stranger was a very positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove out into the woods following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off when we pulled up to this campsite. There was one RV parked there, and 2 cars further up into the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man opened the door. Tez waved hello to him, but he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't ever acknowledged him, he just slowly closed the door again, staring at us the whole time. Figuring he just wanted some privacy and thought we'd be obnoxious, we pulled in further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while it was still light out, we goofed around for a while, smoking, laughing, and taking dumb fun photos of ourselves. Tez pointed out a campfire further down the campsite and we decided to go be friendly. We'd met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks after all by just going up and offering beer, or just offering a friendly chat. So we wandered over. Near the campfire there were 2 men. the owners of the cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed very friendly, so we sat down to chat with them. They were drinking and smoking, and we sat down and shared a beer together. One of the men seemed pretty off, though. We came to find that the two of them didn't actually know one another at all. The older man was definitely on some sort of drugs, spinning in circles and talking about UFOs. However, he seemed fairly harmless. This left us to chat with the younger man, who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and very easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting about our trip, our families, basically everything. Then he started talking about the bear. He'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Tez didn't believe him, so he pulled out his camera to show her photos of this bear. It was very close to the campsite, so we were both a little bit freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around very close spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice turned very cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not the bear you should be worried about, you know." I kept waiting for the laugh, or for him to nudge Tez with his elbow and signify it was a joke. Joke's on the foreigner and the city girl, right? But he never did. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed as well, and joked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved on to another subject, but within 5 minutes the ranger had come back around to it, and was talking about something grabbing us from our car in the middle of the night. No matter how we tried to steer the conversation away from this, he just kept latching back on. Of course, the older man was as high as a kite at this point, staring off into the stars and not even talking. We just awkwardly laugh and sip our beer, and try to get the conversation going elsewhere. Then the ranger stood up and walked toward the cooler to get another beer. At this point it was pitch black out, and I couldn't see anything outside the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was just outside of that circle. Suddenly, there was a red dot in the darkness. It took me a moment for me to realize that it was a camera. The ranger was now holding a camera and taking photos of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera lit up. Now, it wasn't odd for people we'd met to ask to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous, dark hair, blue eyes, almost like a young Megan Fox, and we were very friendly. Plus, people like having pictures of themselves. It was an entirely different thing, though, to have this person standing in the dark taking photos of us without asking, or even indicating that's what he was doing. We were both staring at him like deer in the headlights at this point, but instead of realizing what he was doing was a bit weird, he checked his camera and adjusted to take some other photos, this time with a flash. Not asking us to smile, no proposing a group photo, no explanation at all. After this, he came and sat back down at the fire and didn't say a single word about it. At this point, Tez and I were mutually freaked out. We made some BS excuse that we needed to go set up our campsite and nope the hell out. When we stood up to leave, the UFO guy was actually very kind and smiled and told us to have a good night. The ranger, however, looked at us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in these woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. I wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire very quickly. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing that RV, and jumped in the front seats. My friend Tez was all but hyperventilating. Why did he take pictures of us? I was shaking. I responded, "I read that sometimes serial killers warn their victims or something." She stared at me for a moment and locked the car doors. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We both freaked out. She was in full panic and turned on the headlights of the car. I immediately told her to turn them off, because now he knew exactly where it was. God knows why, but that's the only night we'd not set up camp yet, so we didn't need to tear anything down. We put the car in drive and floored it out of that campsite. As we pulled onto the dirt road, we could see the ranger walking out of the darkness towards our car, with that same cold expression. So I'm gonna preface this by saying I am a terrible writer, so I apologize if things aren't perfect. I'm gonna post this a few places to see if anyone can help me understand what exactly happened these past few nights. I lived in Southern California my entire life. If you know anything about California, you know it's very diverse. Up north is filled with mountains and trees. The south is a lot more, well, city-like. This summer, I decided to take a trip to Lake Tahoe. It's a beautiful place, and it was my first time being upstate. I'm going to chop this story up into segments to make it an easier read. Day 1. I settled into the cabin at around 5 p.m. after an 8-hour drive. I was extremely tired. I went and laid down in the bed that was in the loft. It was so quiet. It was almost like being in a completely different world. I was so used to cars zooming by and people talking right outside my house, but here it was perfectly silent. I fell asleep fairly quickly. Around 4 hours into my sleep, though, I suddenly jerked up from my sleep. I looked around a bit before hearing this strange tapping. I looked around to see where it was coming from, but I couldn't find anything. It sounded, though, like someone was tapping on the window part of the back door. I figured I was just being paranoid since I didn't find anything, and fell back asleep fairly quickly. On day 2, nothing happened and I slept perfectly fine. Day 3, I woke up early in the morning, maybe around 4 or so. I'd heard a crash coming from the attic ladder that was placed conveniently right behind the couch I was sleeping on. I didn't dare move. I could hear footsteps coming behind me. You know that feeling you get when someone is staring at you? That's exactly how I felt in that moment. I was laying on my side just staring straight ahead when I felt somebody or something begin to crawl over me. I felt 2 hands on either side of me. I knew their face must be inches away from mine. Like I said, I was facing straight ahead. There was no way in hell I was going to have the bravery to turn my face and see who it was. It felt like they stayed there like that, hovering over me for what felt like forever, until I felt them suddenly crawl backwards and then off the couch. I heard the dog let out a muffled bark, to which someone shushed her and then let out a small, "Good girl." The presence stayed there for what felt like an eternity, until I heard footsteps going out the back door. Still, I hadn't moved at all. I was completely paralyzed with fear. Needless to say, I could not find a way to go back to sleep. I checked on my friends a bit later on when I felt the coast was clear. None of them had left their rooms that night. I told them about my experience, but they just said I was being paranoid. I halfway agreed with them myself, and our day continued on as planned. Day 3, later that day. After spending the whole day at the lake with my friends, we came back to a quiet and cozy cabin. The caretakers of the cabin had told us there was a river a bit farther back into the woods, about a 15-minute walk away. My friends decided to stay back and rest, so I took some bug spray and a small backpack filled with snacks and my phone. It was a pretty straightforward trail all in all. There was some tall grass on either side of it. It was a very thin path, but it was fairly easy to navigate. When I got to the riverbank, there were 2 picnic tables set out there. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, but for some reason I stupidly wore sandals for this walk. I put my bag on the table and started my walk back to the cabin. For some odd reason, though, I felt like the path now seemed different than before. What once seemed like a straightforward trail now seemed to be covered in rough terrain. I noticed as well the tall grass on the sides of the path had been disturbed too. It was as if a big animal had walked across it. At first, I thought maybe there was a bear or something, since the locals had told us that bears were a problem around this type of year. But the sheer size of the depressions made me second-guess that. I was a bit taken aback by everything. However, I continued and made it back to the cabin to grab some shoes. Then I went back to the river. I was a bit frightened now, though. I kept telling myself I was just freaking myself out. I should just enjoy the nature. I sat down at one of those tables and watched the peaceful river. After a while, though, it felt like there was something staring at me. I looked around, assuming one of my friends was on their way to prank me, but I couldn't see anyone around me. Across the river, I noticed that a bit of brush had been shaken up. There was a clearing in the bushes that was fenced off by 2 logs in an X shape. The longer I sat in that spot, the more and more worried I got. I couldn't help but start to feel like there was something behind that thick brush that I just barely couldn't make out. I went down to the river, hoping to come across anything. There was no fish, no frogs, no roads, just a bunch of mosquitoes, and a whole lot of them at that. Disappointed with the lack of finding anything really, I went to sit back at the table, and that's when I heard it. It was a noise I can barely even begin to describe. It was a scream, but like a gurgle, as if whatever it was had a mouthful of water. It was completely inhuman. I froze. In this moment, I should have been running for my life, but I just froze there. All of a sudden, I could hear rustling in the bushes behind me, those very same ones I'd had that feeling from earlier. Then again, that scream. It was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I sprinted my ass through the forest. What should have been a quick trip back to the cabin was anything but. It felt like 10 minutes of full sprinting before I noticed that I was completely lost. I stopped for a few moments, frantic, to see if I could find anything that looked familiar. I saw a bridge I had crossed on the way there and started sprinting once more. I thought to myself, why won't this damn thing just kill me? I stopped for a good minute there. I could hear it still chasing behind me, as if whoever was doing this was playing a sick game. Every time I stopped, whatever was behind me would as well. Finally, I made it back to the cabin. Instead of going inside, I stood there on the porch in shock. I faced out towards the forest, and I cried. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I could feel whatever it was that was chasing me was just out of view. I didn't want to turn my back to it at this point, so I sat there for hours, silently crying, occasionally checking my phone, and of course afterward writing this. I don't know what the hell was going on there. Maybe it was a wendigo or a bear or a person, I don't really know. All I know is that I'll never be going back to that river again. If you could please shed some insight on what or who you think might have been out there, I would really appreciate it. These 2 days have just been too weird to not be connected at all. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university, working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period of time. The area my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my uni in the Pacific Northwest. There were 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor as well. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought this big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for that sort of thing, so I declined the offer at the time. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Turned out the next morning, the 5 students who had shared the soup weren't exactly in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning and were in no shape to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us had originally had some rules laid out, such as people traveling in groups of at least 2 and all returning to camp by nightfall. Now those rules had to be tossed out to make sure we could keep our timetable and collect all of the required samples. At this point, we were just told, do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning, I set out for a very long day of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into the stream I was meant to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant I really had to hustle to get back before dark. About halfway through the day, though, I realized that was not going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful, until I smelled the smell of cigarettes. It wasn't exactly the smell of a cigarette being actively smoked, more like the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car, where the butts had been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around, but I couldn't see anyone. I assumed the wind must have blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me, but minutes later, that smell still hadn't faded yet. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there were a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or a bush. I was very unnerved. Someone was apparently staying close enough for me to smell them for this long, without so much as a single word. I quickly packed up the trash from my lunch and continued my way up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled that smell again. The woods were really getting dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to camp in the dark would be very dangerous, even without a cigarette-smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes away in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkening woods, looking for whoever was giving off that smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention at first. It would actually be more correct to say I saw too many things in the dim light that may have possibly been a head sticking out from behind a tree or someone crouched low in the foliage. I didn't exactly like the idea of being in these dark woods with a stranger, who for the second time was lurking near me without revealing themselves, so I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back even though it was dark, because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't manage to get back till a bit before 10. I was the very last one to make it back, and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to him because he seemed very tired as it was. He headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back, and I headed back to my tent soon after. At some point during the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business, as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill and might need the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I had walked about 100 feet into the woods and found a tree and did what I needed to do. As I turned back to go to camp, though, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods, I could see a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it was, until it flared momentarily, and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while, watching that red ember glow, fade, then move slightly closer to the ground, as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see this person, I assumed they were watching our camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light around. I made my way slowly back to camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. When we got outside the RV, though, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning, and we took turns watching over camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty, and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker had been standing the night before. Sure enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground, right next to a tree. The tree itself looked like someone had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp object into it, as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, even though we hadn't collected all of the samples we were assigned, to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway, though, a white paneled van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began to follow us. The van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was already closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van had not followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple of hours before I left the biological sciences building and started heading toward the dorm building I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. I was a couple dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with the musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards away in the darkness just off the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but I hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late and having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this, though, as the musty smell was the same as what I'd smelled in the woods that previous night. I started down the footpath, and soon passed whoever it was that was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I peeked over my shoulder, only to see the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was clearly following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but still I held it together. That is, until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white paneled van parked alone in the lot. I took off at a sprint towards my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run and saw the cigarette fall to the ground and a dark shape begin chasing after me. I didn't dare to look back again, but I could hear someone running in the grass just off the footpath. I got to the entrance of my dorm building and frantically waved my keycard in front of the card reader that controlled the door lock. As soon as I heard the soft beep, I opened the door, jumped through the doorway, and shut the door quickly. I stopped and peered back through that glass door. I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light was just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and the brim of a baseball cap before it disappeared and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I got to my window overlooking the same yard I had just run through, there was no trace of that dark figure or a cigarette cherry. After that, I didn't see the white paneled van ever again, or smell that same cigarette smell, and I hope I never do. I've commented the short version of this once before, but I'd like to share it with more people. This experience was legit one of the most terrifying things that's happened to me walking my dog, and he's done some pretty weird stuff, like pulling a used condom out of a bush and whipping it around like helicopter blades. Back in 2015, I had the choice of getting a dog or getting a smartphone. I'd never had a dog in my life, or a decent phone, come to think of it. I'd been saving up for a phone anyhow, so naturally I picked the dog. My dad knew a feller who had a couple of border collies that had recently had a litter, so we drove out, and the dude gave me the last pup. Enter Bailey. A couple of weeks after he got his shots, I started walking him. My parents figured I was going to be hanging out at the local park with my new pup, so I could get him socialized, but no. I chose to take him around the perimeter of a nearby farm to keep the farm dog in him. I'd been sneaking out to this farm for years. The farmer was an old family friend. My uncles had grown up working for him, so I knew if I was ever caught I could just drop their name and get off scot-free. On either side of the farm there was some thick woodland, which no one had ever given me a reason to be wary of. They probably should have, though. So, it's a sunny afternoon. It had been pouring down all week, and Bailey was itching for a good walk. I take him to the farm at our usual time, and we start making our way around to the woods on the east side of the farm. Everything was fairly quiet, but of course Bailey keeps darting away from me to explore. He's a puppy after all, that's kind of what they do. Of course, I'd been calling his name all the way around the field. We were about halfway past the woods. I could see the roof of the farmhouse over the next hill. Bailey's been pulling crap out of the bushes all the way along, and I'd just given him some trouble for rolling around in a pile of fox crap. That's when I heard a man's voice calling my dog by his name. This dude I didn't even know was now calling out my dog's name. I knew it was not the farmer because I'd met him at family events like barbecues and weddings before. I knew this was not what his voice sounded like. I went completely silent, but the man continued to call out for my dog. It sounded like he was deep into the woods and moving as well. What creeps me out the most was that he was calling out with such an excited tone in his voice. Bailey, meanwhile, was completely ignoring this guy and sniffing the now flat pile of crap. So I'm like a tiny 18-year-old girl. The most combat experience I have is a month of learning Taekwondo when I was 11, and I didn't have a mobile phone either. If that guy worked out where I was fucked. And if Bailey decided to go in after him, I was double fucked. There was no way I was letting a possible psycho get his hands on my puppy. I could either run to the farm, which wasn't too far away, or run back through the field towards home. I grabbed up my pup and sprinted across the field. Behind me, I could hear someone emerge from the woods, but I was already over the fence by then, and sprinting home with my puppy tucked under my arm. I went home and told my mom, but she brushed it off as just some weird drunk guy. A few weeks later, I'm at my uncle's house, and the farmer walks in. I told my uncle what happened, so he brought it up to the farmer as well. The farmer asked exactly which woods I'd been close to, and said that some of his clothes had gone missing from his washing line recently. He'd put it down to strong winds blowing them away, but now he was not so sure. I took him and my uncle to the exact spot the next day. All three of us go in and find a completely wrecked campsite. There's no clothes or anything, but the tent has collapsed in on itself. There's no fire either, but there are some empty gas canisters, like you'd use for a portable stove, and empty packets of food scattered everywhere. We reported it to the police, but nothing really ever came of it. Except that I got a phone not too long after, and keep it on me now whenever I go out. I suppose this is pretty ironic, given yesterday I made a post about them being super suspicious of the mailman. But I have two Australian shepherds. One is my personal dog and the other is a foster dog. Both are roughly around 60 pounds or so. I took them on a walk today at a local wilderness area that consists of about 50 miles of trails in total. I've been there many times with just my dog and never had any problems. Anyway, we're walking down the trail and they do bark at a few people we see walking by. Every time I see someone, we step to the side off the trail and let them pass us by. I apologize to them, the person smiles and keeps walking, we all carry on with our merry way. That's how it usually goes. So when I see this one guy approaching and the dogs go immediately into alert mode, I didn't think very much of it. We just stepped off so he could pass us by. He gets right up to us and stops though, and leans in. "Oh, I don't think your dogs like me very much." I told him no, they're just nervous. I apologized for them being so loud. And at this point I was holding them by their harnesses so they were super close to me. They were just going absolutely crazy though. Angry barking, lunging, growling. I know that's not great behavior, but I couldn't really do anything about it in the moment. "I'm really sorry they don't like me. I'm so sorry." At this point, I was really weirded out because he'd not broken eye contact a single time, and seemed rather unfazed by the dogs as well. I again told him it was okay, not his fault. I told the dogs, let's go, and begin to guide them away. The man calls out from behind and says he's going to keep moseying on up the trail. I say alright and tell him to have a good day, and we walk off in completely opposite directions. I thought it was a strange interaction, but hey, we can all be a little bit weird, right? So I tried not to think about it too much. About 2 minutes later though, suddenly I hear him calling out from behind me, and I turn around to see him swiftly approaching. I really want to be friends with your dogs. I don't want to leave them on bad terms. I want to make lots of friends, you know, he says as he keeps walking closer and closer. When I come up on nervous dogs, I usually leave them alone, or if I do try to make friends, I squat down, talk gently to them, extend a hand. He never did any of this though. I swear he never even looked at my dogs. He was just staring at me the whole time. This time, the dogs were starting to go absolutely nuts again, but I didn't grab their harness this time. I let them have the full length of the leash to put some distance between us and the man. He kept yelling out repeatedly that he just wanted to be friends. I told him I didn't think that would happen. They just weren't there yet. He tries to approach still, but the dogs are having none of that. Eventually, he just says, "I'm sorry, I don't think they're going to be friends with me." But again, he's just staring dead into my eyes, not even looking at the dogs. I tell him no, they're not, and he won't be getting any closer to any of us. Finally, he turned to leave. I called my sister for the remainder of the walk. It can be annoying that sometimes my dogs freak out over the mailman or the neighbors or a knocking noise on the TV show. I don't know for a fact that this man today had any bad intentions, but I'm damn sure glad they were there and made it abundantly clear he wasn't getting anywhere near me. I'll probably try to work with them on calming down quicker, but I have no plans to let them befriend strangers at first sight. I've lived in 4 creepy and, I believe anyway, haunted houses. They all had some pretty horrifying things happen in them, but the third one was the scariest by far. I was in high school when me, my mom, and my stepdad lived there. I moved in with them when I was 15. My mom had just married him a few months before. Anyway, one night I noticed the doorknob on my bedroom door had started shaking, like very horribly shaking. It was locked though. I thought perhaps it was a train passing by on the nearby tracks, but it kept on happening. I got scared then and thought that maybe it was my stepdad trying to be a creep. I didn't know him very well at that point in time. I started leaving it unlocked to try and see if it was him still trying to get in. Still though, even with the door unlocked, it would just keep on shaking. Then it began to happen day, night, basically any time I would shut that door. Sometimes I would get up at night to get a snack, since I had a hard time sleeping when I was a kid. I'd hear footsteps behind me, or the floor creaking. It was a really small house too, and I knew nobody else was up. It's not like there was anywhere to hide either. Sometimes I'd feel my shirt get tugged too, from behind. Just on the bottom of it though, like a little kid might do when they wanted to get your attention. The scariest 2 things, to me anyway, were one morning when it was winter, probably at 6 a.m., so still very dark out. I was in the living room watching TV and getting ready for school. My stepdad was in the back of the house in his room sleeping, and my mom was heading out the front door to work. She turned around and called out goodbye to me, and all of a sudden both of us heard this little girl's voice, clear as day, shouting, "Goodbye." My mom looked over at me to see if I'd done that, and I told her no. Her husband came running up asking what happened, and my mom told him what we'd just heard. Then she said, "Well, I'm leaving now," and she left in a big hurry. The last scary thing that happened was our neighbor whose backyard was connected to ours came over to yell at my mom suddenly one day. saying what a shitty mother she was for letting my sister out all night to play on the swings. We had a rope tied to a tree that no one ever used. My youngest sister lived in another town with my dad, so my mom was of course really confused. The neighbor said she would go out to smoke at night and would always see a little girl swinging on the rope and laughing, and she'd see it multiple times whenever she went out. My aunt works at the city and did some research, saying that our house had been moved from another location. It was really, really old. So I don't know if it's haunted or what was up with that little girl or what, but it was pretty scary at the time. This happened at a large shopping center in Adelaide, South Australia a couple of months ago. For some context, it was around 7 p.m. on a late trading night, already completely dark outside. I was shopping with my partner and she had gone into a clothing store, both to make some returns and also to try on some replacement clothes. I knew this would take a bit of time, and I'm not overly interested in women's clothing. So I stood outside in the very busy center. I was responding to some work emails on my phone, paying very little attention to all of the people walking past. After about 5 minutes though, I was approached by a fairly young-looking gentleman, early to mid-20s at most. I'm only 23 myself. He had a very strong European accent, possibly French. He came up to me and said something along the lines of, "You were with a girl, yes? She was just looking for you. She came up to me, I think, because we're wearing similar shirts and thought you were me." Thinking back on it, other than the buttons, our shirts were not very similar at all. He told me she was really trying to find me and made it seem like something was very wrong. He insisted he could take me to where she just went. I looked into the store and could no longer see my partner in there. It was a fairly small clothing store inside the center. You could see basically all of it from the outside. I found out later though, she was just in a changing room at that moment. I was extremely confused at the time though. My partner knows I would just aimlessly be pacing in circles outside, as I do when I'm reading emails. She would never walk off looking for me unless something was really wrong. Not to mention she also could have texted or called. Although very confused, he was moving away fast enough that I didn't really have time to ask many more questions, and not able to see my partner inside, he convinced me to at least follow where he was going. There had to have been hundreds of people around as well, so I wasn't particularly worried for my own well-being. As I followed this gentleman, I was leaving a good 2 or so meters between us walking behind. I don't remember feeling overly unsafe or concerned about being near him. Just extremely confused and starting to get really worried. He could see that, and kept repeating something along the lines of, "This isn't a joke, please believe me, I just want to help. Come with me, she went this way, I saw where she went." We had only been walking for about 10 seconds, but covering a fair bit of distance from the store I was originally at. I kept trying to pry it out of him. "Where was she going? What did she say to you?" "Sorry, my English isn't very good. She's just this way." We kept walking like this for another 10 seconds or so, before we reached the doors to the outside of the building. We were on a side of the center that had doors leading to both a car park and a large loading dock for one of the supermarkets. Although busy inside the center, there was almost no one around the doors going in or out. He walked straight outside and said something like, "She was just outside sitting on this bench. I don't know where she went." Other than a small bit of light under the cover where a bench was, it was completely dark as soon as you walked any further away. I started to walk up to the point where the automatic doors opened, but no further. I looked around, 1 foot outside and 1 foot in. "She must have gone this way. Come on, I'll help you find her." He started to walk to the left, which led to a dark and secluded loading dock, which was not visible from the doors. You could tell the urgency he was trying to convey to follow him. I was very unsure until that point, but as soon as that happened, I knew whatever he wanted me to follow him down there for was not any good. It was one of those moments where you suddenly piece it all together and realize how many warning signs you somewhat noticed but just ignored. Instantly, it felt like I was suddenly in danger. I remember saying, "All good, thanks, I'll just call her." I turned straight around and sprinted back inside. I turned around after a few moments, but he had completely disappeared. Although it felt like a huge amount of time, all of this transpired in about 45 seconds from when he first started talking to me. It was at that point I texted my partner, who let me know she was still at the same store I'd last seen her at. At the time, I told her I thought I was almost abducted, perhaps a bit over the top, especially for a large 20-year-old bloke, I think. I'm assuming if I went down there, I was at least going to get robbed, though. I'm glad that hopefully I'll never know. I went straight to security and reported it. They took some details of where and when it happened, but they didn't seem very concerned at all. This happened 1 year and 2 days ago. It was the day I never expected to come. It changed my life in so many ways that I still feel like I can't digest it. I want to start by saying a little bit about myself, so you understand the context and why it was so weird and foreign for something like this to happen to me. I'm a fairly geeky guy. I love science fiction, video games. I worked at the time as a design engineer in a factory and spent most of my weekends with friends hiking, playing board games, or watching movies. So now you realize that nothing I did would attract the attention of the cartels. I don't have a lot of money either. I just live a lower middle class type life here in Mexico. But the real issue was my sister, who has a high-ranking position in the public security area of politics. That is the main reason I was targeted. It was a Tuesday early morning. I was on my way to work, which started at 6 a.m. I remember that day that I took my dad's SUV because they were away on vacation and I was supposed to pick them up at the airport after work that day. I lived about half an hour away from my work, so I left at about 5:25 a.m. every morning. When I was leaving, I saw a pretty shady SUV parked about a block away from my house. Honestly, after my sister took her job, I was more aware about these kinds of things that I saw out of place. I felt a bit paranoid now, because weeks before it happened that I felt like someone had been following me. So yeah, I passed by this SUV. I saw a guy in the driver's seat with a baseball cap over his face. I stopped for a bit and looked at him. He just looked down and covered his face even more. I honestly didn't think too much of it. My family had been telling me for weeks prior that I was just overreacting. No one was following me. I thought it was just some random guy who must be waiting for someone. I took off to work, and for me to get there, I have to go through a really ugly neighborhood, which is poorly lit and has a very bad reputation. I was on a 2-lane street that was only one way. I was in the right lane at the time. Just then, I saw a Jeep Cherokee speed by me on the left lane and continue on its way in front of me. When we arrived at the end of the street, I had to turn right to get to work. The Cherokee completely stopped in the right lane right in front of me, with its blinker signaling to the left. I found this weird, but I didn't want to be an asshole and honk at them. I wanted to at least give them a few seconds to move out of the way. While I was waiting, though, an Explorer came screeching up in the left lane and stopped right next to me. 4 guys jumped out of it with guns, and one with a baseball bat. The guy with the bat smashed my window and hit me in the face. Another put a gun to my head and said, "This is real, asshole. Get out of the car." Please understand that at that moment, I did not feel like they wanted to steal my car. I already knew they were here for me. If I knew they just wanted the car, I would have given it to them, but I pieced everything together. The cars that I felt were following me at night every day. That guy just sitting in an SUV outside of my place, and obviously my sister's job. I knew that if they took me, it would be torture, followed by certain death, and if they really wanted to kidnap me, they would not kill me. So I stepped on the gas. I smashed between the Cherokee and the Explorer and ran over one of the guys. I sped as much as the SUV could give me and honked so I could make a lot of noise and people would notice. My hope was to get to my workplace, which had private security, and call my sister so she could mobilize the police. With all of the adrenaline coursing through me, I passed the entrance to my work and tried to turn back, but I crashed on a corner. At that moment, I felt like my heart would burst out of my mouth. Everything was moving in slow motion. I tried to calm myself down. I breathed and checked through my mirrors to see if they were following me. I saw no one, only an empty street that was already lit by the morning dusk. The SUV was still functioning. I turned around and got to work. I yelled at the security guards to open the doors. I parked at the entrance, got out of the car, and called my sister. After that, I went inside and talked to my boss about what had happened, and went to the restroom to clean the glass and blood off my hair and face. When I came out of the restroom and out of the parking lot, there were about 10 cop cars outside my workplace. My sister had already told me to speak with a specific police officer and confirm his name. Everything went smoothly and I felt very safe and protected. After that, I moved into my sister's house, which had police guarding it at all times. I have bodyguards that are with me every time I go out now. This has cost me my job, relationships, lifelong friendships. Everyone's afraid to hang out with you when they know you're a target for the cartels, and it's understandable, but it doesn't make me feel any less shitty. Investigations continued through the beginning of 2017. I later found out through security camera footage that there were 3 SUVs in total, with 12 people trying to kidnap me. I found out the cartel that was after me was one of the most powerful ones in the world, and the person who was in charge of investigating my case was apparently killed. So right now I'm working for the Mexican government. It's a low-profile job which does not pay much and does not attract too much attention. I've looked for ways to leave the country, but I don't have enough money or qualifications. I'm a college dropout. I'm still living with my sister, with people protecting me and my family 24 hours a day. The guys who tried to kidnap me are still at large. I'm trying to make the best of this situation. I've lost a lot of weight, I spend more time with my nephews, and recently got into a steady relationship. But honestly, I'm always on edge, and feel like I'm in imminent danger. I have a phobia that goes by a few names. Scopophobia, ophthalmophobia, basically the fear of being watched. I have this weird compulsion. Whenever I see a doorway, a window, or virtually any surface I believe someone could hide behind, I imagine a face peering out at me, staring at me. I imagine what I would do. What could I do? And you'll soon find out why I have this phobia. On to my story. I'll try my best to remember all the details, but my mind has honestly repressed quite a lot of it. Around June of 2016, my mother and I were living in a small apartment. There was no basement or attic, obviously, but there was one tiny crawl space in the closet floor of my bedroom. I never actually looked in it. I suppose some people would be overwhelmed with curiosity, but my mind had already imagined all of the worst scenarios. I decided to leave whatever dead bodies and ghosts were down there for whoever rented after us. It was a very nice apartment, actually. Small, but perfect for the two of us. We lived there for a few peaceful months, until the noises started. At first, it was nothing extreme, just the odd bump in the night, and particularly some scratching. My mom brushed it off as rats in the walls. As long as they stayed in there, I saw no reason to get rid of them. A week or two later, I had already grown used to all that noise. It became almost comforting in a way. After all, I never really liked complete silence. That is, until I awoke one night to a very different noise. A rolling sound, eerily similar to the sound my closet made whenever I opened it. I peeked my eyes and looked over, but I couldn't make out anything in the dark. I thought just maybe I'd seen something move, but I was well aware of how the mind plays tricks on you in the dark. There was only one way to find out. I turned on my lamp. I feel like crying just writing this out. It's been almost a year since I've had to recall this night. When I turned on the light, I expected to just see a closet full of coats, but what I saw was much, much worse. There was an eye. Not just an eye, but the entire half of someone's face, just barely visible through the tiny crack he had just opened. He didn't even react to being caught. No smile, no fear. He just sat there watching me. My heart had never beat faster than that night. I wish I had screamed, or maced him, or done anything, but I just stared back, frozen in time, until I couldn't hold it in anymore. I began to sob loudly. I think I tried to say something along the lines of, "What do you want?" but it was garbled by all my crying. He opened the door more. I could now see his entire body, which I don't care to describe, as I've spent 2 long years trying to forget that face. Shh. I lost my breath at that. Hearing him made it so real. I couldn't pretend this was some fucked up hallucination anymore. At this, I sat up and pressed my back against the wall. "It's okay. It's okay, my name." He said it so cheerfully. It gives me chills just remembering it. This is when I finally summoned the courage to run out of the room. This creep knew my name somehow. My fucking name. My mom, still half asleep while she called the police, thought I'd imagined everything. Of course, by the time the police actually got there, he was already long gone. All that was left of him was that damn crawl space. I still never looked inside, though writing this now, I kinda wish I did. Having some sort of proof of this would, I don't know, comfort me. At least everyone would know I'm not crazy when I tell this story. Apparently, he had been living there. For how long, I can't really say. But the officers who first arrived on the scene said there were tally marks inside the crawl space. I didn't ask them how many. I didn't want to know whether he was marking the days, weeks, or even years. I just wanted to leave that fucking apartment, and we did. The police never found him. Not for certain, at least. They thought they found a homeless man who matched his description, but he was apparently unresponsive. I've always thought they didn't take it all that seriously. They just thought he was a squatter, even after I told them that he somehow knew my name. They thought that given how long he had seemingly been squatting, maybe he had just heard it through the floorboards or something. Since that night, he has been the face I always see when there's an open door or closet. It's grown more distorted as time goes on, but I can always make out a part of his pursed lips, as if he's still shushing me, even now. It's gotten easier with time, but I don't think it will ever leave me completely. Anyway, I guess we didn't actually have rats in the end. My biggest mistake in high school was agreeing to take an AP physics class with the seniors. I was a rising sophomore at that time, so when I walked into a class with kids much older than I was, my teacher sat me next to the only other person there who was close to my age. He was a freshman, and his name was Josh. Josh was one of those people who gave off weird vibes. He had a sloppily shaven head, empty eyes, and ate warm Skittles in glass. He was short but mean-looking, and the instant I sat down next to him, my teacher ordered us to exchange numbers and tried to make us start talking. For some reason, I really did not want to talk to him. I wasn't trying to be an asshole or anything, but he just kind of scared me. Sitting next to him, I felt what can only be described as sitting next to a hungry dog while you're holding onto a big piece of chicken. It felt like at any second he would jump on me, even though he was a good 6 inches shorter than me. It really freaked me out that he had my phone number and my name. Even though I didn't know the kid, I had a feeling that him knowing literally anything about me was not good. Luckily, he didn't talk to me for over a week. And after some time, I thought I was just being overly judgmental perhaps. maybe he was just a socially awkward kid. One day, about 3 weeks after I started class with him, he finally talked to me. He asked something like, "You're that girl that drives the F-150, right?" I reluctantly said, "Yeah." He then told me that cars were a bit of a hobby of his, and he had seen me driving around and really liked my truck. Although I was caught a bit off guard, he seemed innocent about it and nice enough, and we started to kind of become friends after that. He started texting me a lot after school, asking me a bit about myself, and sharing a bit about himself too. Like I said, he seemed really innocent at this time. But still, for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be telling him anything about myself, and I should not be talking to him. This average conversation continued for a month or so, until one day when I came home from work. I worked at a restaurant about 20 minutes away from my house, so when I turned off my phone to drive to work, I honestly wouldn't turn it back on until I drove home, as phones were prohibited at the restaurant. One week, I came home at 12 a.m. after doing closing shift. He had sent me several odd texts. They pretty much all consisted of, "I love you," and "I want to take you to homecoming. Please be my girlfriend." They all rubbed me the wrong way. He didn't really seem to be asking, so much as he was demanding me to have a relationship with him. I was kinda not comfortable with that. I ultimately friend-zoned him. I told him I was going to bed. His response was no. Just no. It freaked me out and made me really not want to go to class on Monday, but I had no choice. I had to go. He didn't text me for the rest of the weekend, and when I sulked my way into class on Monday, he gave me the same hungry dog stare from day one. I ignored him the whole class. I practically ran when the bell rang, and when I got to my car in the student parking lot, I saw him watch me drive away from the sidewalk. It freaked me out more than I'd like to admit, so I called one of my guy friends and asked him if I could drive him home from school so I'd feel safer, at least until creepy Josh would start being less creepy. He agreed, and we made an arrangement there and then. A lot of people thought I was overreacting, but I just knew in my gut I needed someone in that car with me, and this guy friend seemed like the right one. When I came home from work at 10-ish on Monday night, I opened my phone and saw even more texts from Josh. This time, they were much more predatory than the night before, as this night they were detailing how he would like me to perform sexual acts on him. I foolishly allowed this to happen for another couple weeks, feeling uncomfortable in class, when it finally hit a breaking point. Josh started sending me texts about how if I wouldn't love him, then he had to die. At that point, I decided it was time to involve the dean, but she virtually did nothing. She basically explained that Josh was special needs and to cut him some slack, despite the predatory tone of the messages. She told me she would talk to him about it, but to not be worried because he likely wouldn't do anything. I was infuriated and told my dad, who told his army of Italian brothers, who all decided to keep an eye on him. The creepy messages didn't get any worse. Eventually, they stopped after I blocked his number. That, though, was when the really creepy shit started. The cameras outside our house started to pick up a person at night, someone very similar looking to Josh. He kept knocking on the windows, looking into my car, so my dad called the cops, who were actually pretty awesome and kept a lookout on my house for a while to deter those nightly visits. With a cop outside at night, the visits stopped, but my work started getting calls from Josh very frequently, asking when I'd be working. My manager ended up alerting security, who threatened him to stop calling. Then, Josh decided to start frequenting the restaurant where I worked every day, and leave paper cranes on the table, saying, "I love you, my name," and "my boyfriend's name isn't good for you, I am." He started following me to class, to my car, to work. Even though I would always pretend he wasn't there and was still driving my 6'3" guy friend home, I refused to leave my house without a group of people and debated skipping prom and becoming a hermit because he was making me feel so unsafe anywhere. Eventually, my dad decided getting a restraining order would be a good idea. I did get one granted, so he couldn't walk near me or contact me for 5 years. Thankfully, this finally caused this year-long nightmare to stop. I didn't see Josh again until my senior year, when I was walking down the hall with my friends and he saw me coming, stopped in his tracks, and slowly watched me walk past him with that same hungry look that initially scared me the day I met him. You're probably wondering why he never got in any trouble when I contacted the dean and the police. Well, where I live, there's a bunch of laws that make it exponentially harder for someone with special needs to be punished for creepy behavior, even though they're just as capable to execute than the average person. The last time I saw Josh was on graduation, when I could have sworn he was in one of the front rows waiting for me to get my diploma. Although it's possible he was there for someone else, a part of me knows he was there for me. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that this can happen to anyone. I never thought this would happen to me, until it did and robbed me of my safety, my high school experience, and my peace of mind. Always trust your instincts on someone. You are not required to be nice to anyone who makes you uncomfortable. That leads me to now. I'm happy, in a serious relationship with an awesome guy, and in a weird way, I'm glad I was able to learn from this whole experience. This happened to me a few years back when I was in my early 20s. At the time, I worked in a department store at a makeup counter. This job relies heavily on good customer service and building relationships because you want people to keep coming back to spend money on your products. We're given personalized business cards so we can build our own client base, very important for a commission department. It's not uncommon to be familiar with the people who frequently shop the store, as workers, our training is focused on being friendly and accommodating. One day while I was working, I had to move to a makeup counter that wasn't my own to cover someone else's lunch break. It was a really slow day, so I was just leaning on the counter, sort of people watching. I could tell most shoppers were just browsing, so I kept to myself. One of the people I had noticed going around was a very tall and broad man. He walked very slowly, almost hunched over. His face was fixed very aggressively, like he was angry but focused on something. He circled around the counter a few times, but I could feel his gaze on me instead of the products. After a few rotations around the department, I decided to greet him in case he needed any help. It wasn't until he'd actually come directly over to me that I realized just how huge this man actually was. I'm 4'10", 140-pound female, so I felt pretty small regardless, but even with his slouched-over posture, he was over 6 feet tall and well over twice my weight. I'll never forget his teeth either. They were completely black in the front. Your eyes couldn't help but be drawn right to them. Despite his menacing appearance, though, he was very soft-spoken. Truthfully, I could tell he wasn't all there just by the way he talked. He told me no when I asked if he needed any help, but requested my number instead. So direct. We had never spoken before. I declined and said I was already in a relationship and that it would be very inappropriate. He then asked if he could have a business card for the counter in case he wanted to get some products. Since I wasn't on my normal counter and I really wanted him to go away, I handed over my coworker's business card and told him to call if he had any further questions. It worked. He walked away after that, filling me with relief. Only a couple minutes later, the phone on the counter rings. I answer with my peppy customer service voice and say, "Thank you for calling. How may I help you?" Immediately, I knew it was the same guy once he started talking. He again asked me for my personal number, and I explained once again that I cannot do that. He just wants to talk, he explains. Since he wasn't getting the hint, I say, "I should have told you that I'm married. You can't have my number." Politely, he apologized and hung up. I thought that would be the end of him. But for the next few weeks or so, I spent much of my time at work anxious he would show up again. I would see him every week, and he would lurk around the counter searching for me. Anytime I would see him, I would immediately drop what I was doing and run and hide. or run to the closest customer and offer any bit of assistance to make it look like I was very busy so he wouldn't come over and talk to me. I successfully dodged him every time, and it came to the point where I stopped seeing him. I was very thrilled. I had almost completely forgotten about him until one day I decided to go to Walmart by myself to pick up a few things on my day off. I generally like to shop alone. I can take all the time I need, and I like leisurely looking around. I grabbed a basket and made my way over to the cosmetic and wellness section, since that's where most of the things I needed were. I only had managed to grab a few things before I locked eyes with him as I walked by the supplement aisle. I had recently changed my hair color and wasn't wearing my work uniform, so I didn't think he'd realize who I was right away. I was ready to just go about my shopping and ignore him until I realized he'd literally dropped the items he had in his hand and started heading my way. I panicked and quickened my pace immediately. I thought to myself, he's not really going to follow you through the store, right? But as I turned around to look, I could see his humongous body just plowing through people with that same terrifying look on his face, only much meaner. His black teeth were closed in a snarl. Since the direction I was walking was opposite of the exit, and there was no way I was going to turn around now, I decided my best course of action would be to follow the perimeter of the store and cut down the center section, which would bring me close to the registers. I speed walked the entire time in the hopes of losing him amongst all the people, but never once turned around again. By the time I made it to the register area, I could actually feel him behind me. Still not wanting to turn around to look, I glanced in the reflection of the soda machines that are in between the register aisles to see how close he was. To my horror, there was only 1 foot between us. I was afraid to just drop my stuff and run out the door in case he followed me to my car. I had parked in the far back of the parking lot, and I didn't want to risk it. I also didn't want to get in line at the registers since the lines were very long, and I would be standing out in the open alone. Instead, I walked into the cluster of people crowded around the self-checkout line. I noticed another large but older gentleman with his carriage in the middle and ran straight for him. The people were so closely clustered together that the man following me couldn't make it through. I ran over to the man in line and grabbed a hold of his carriage. "I'm so sorry, I'm really not cutting you, but there's a man who's been following me through half the store and I need to stand here with you." He was so sweet, and he let me be there with him while we waited in line. He even let me go ahead of him so I could leave quicker. As I was cashing out, I could see in my peripheral vision my stalker staring at me and pacing about, but he couldn't come near me since the self-checkout was somewhat sectioned off. By the time I had finished and grabbed my receipt, I couldn't see him around anymore. I looked around, but he was nowhere to be seen. I thought about asking the kind older man to walk me to my car, but he still wasn't finished at his register, so I called my boyfriend and decided to make a run for it. Staying on the phone, I explained to him what was going on as I sprinted to my car in tears. I frantically looked around in case he tried to follow me outside. I made it to my car safely and rushed right home, breaking down to my parents about what just happened. I could feel in my bones that that man wanted to do something to me, and thankfully I didn't find out what it was. His aggressive aura was palpable. To this day, I can still remember the adrenaline, the nervousness, and the sheer terror I felt when he followed me. I had never been so vulnerable and helpless, even with all of those people around. I quit that job roughly 2 years later. I had only seen him one other time there since the incident, but I still live in constant fear that we'll cross paths again. I'm afraid to shop alone, something that I wouldn't have given a second thought to years before. Several years ago, we bought a house with a little creek running through the backyard. I mean, who wouldn't want a house with such a tranquil setting? Too long didn't read. When we finally fled in terror 6 years later, we had almost 50 pages of documentation of harassment and terrorization from the next-door neighbor, a 60-something female Listen on if you dare. The third day we owned our new home, our next-door neighbor came over to introduce herself. "Hi, my name is Emma Nasshole." She greeted us very cheerfully. We had an odd conversation, and when she left, hubby and I looked at each other and asked, what the hell was that all about? That afternoon, I joked to my hubby, "I can't believe I just moved next door to someone with plastic flowers in her yard." I was a very avid gardener at the time. The very next morning when we got up, all of the plastic flowers were now gone. It was a very Twilight Zone-like moment. Whether I was gardening in the backyard or the front yard, Emma was soon striking up a conversation every time. She had a way of making statements that would catch you off guard and sort of beg for a reply. She managed to get a lot of personal information from me before I figured out what she was doing. Emma had several dogs, and their barking was a big nuisance. Every night, no matter what time we went to bed, the dogs would start barking under our bedroom window within a minute of turning the lights out. It took us months to figure out she was actively watching for our lights to go out to tell them to bark. How creepy is that? I politely asked this neighbor from hell to keep her dogs away from our bedroom window late at night. She put this huge grin on her face and immediately said, "Nope, can't do that." Then the barking got worse, and worse, and worse, and she stepped up the harassment several notches as well. I would either try to be polite or just put down my gardening tools and go into the house. Even though I never saw her watching me, she always had ways of letting me know that she somehow saw everything I did. It felt like I was being stalked, honestly. She never really bothered my husband, and my husband didn't believe me at first when I told him the things she was doing and saying to me. One day I took hubby's car somewhere and Emma assumed I was home alone. She started in directly with her harassment and creepiness. Needless to say, when I got home, my husband was very shaken. He never doubted me about her again after that. We did have a nice neighbor on the other side of us. One day, I asked her if she had ever had any problems with Emma. She immediately unloaded stories of years of abuse. Oh, swell. Just what had we gotten ourselves into? Eventually, we finally decided to contact animal control and file a complaint about all the barking. They asked us to keep a record of when the dogs started and stopped. The result? They barked between 60 to 70 hours per week. After a couple of weeks, I couldn't waste any more time keeping track. Emma was not very pleased about the dog complaint. Her next move was to call 911 the night of February 13th. At 11:45 p.m., 2 police cruisers and 4 cops showed up at our door for a domestic violence call, courtesy of Emma. Happy Valentine's Day. Every few months after, Emma would suddenly get the urge to call 911 and report me for harassing her, even though by this time I no longer ever spoke to her and went inside immediately whenever she came out. What we didn't know then was that Emma had a wheelchair, and after she called 911, she'd hop in it before the police showed up. She'd tell the cops this sob story about how she was a poor old handicapped senior citizen being brutally harassed by me. I was 2 years younger than her, so yeah, I guess I'm a senior citizen too. The cop would then come over to our house to ream me out for being such a horrible neighbor. Since my hair wasn't gray, I guess thanks to my hairdresser, I looked much younger than Emma, so the cops assumed she was much older and more vulnerable. After several episodes of this, though, we installed covert video cameras. Just 2 months after getting them, Emma had a hankering for the company of a uniformed officer. After hearing her sob story, he came to our house and told us to move away and stop harassing all the neighbors. To his credit, he did agree to view the video footage. The viewings left him speechless afterward. Not only was there no wheelchair in sight, but everything she told him that I said and did to her, she'd actually said and done to me. Shortly before we'd gotten those cameras, Emma had tried to run me down with her car while I was out for a walk. When a friend of hers tried the same trick, we got it on camera this time. I didn't have to call 911 when that happened because Emma called in first with a big pack of lies. The officer that responded this time, though, refused to look at the footage. Oh well. From time to time, she would just park her car in front of our house and sit there watching us. She'd take photos and videos of us inside our house. She only did that once after we got the cameras. They're covert only to a point. If you zoom a camera in on them, you'll see them. She toned down her act after that. Things were quiet for almost a year or so. Then one night we heard a loud boom, and the house suddenly shook. We peeked out the bedroom window and saw a couple of cars parked in front of Emma's house, and a few people milling around her front yard. We got up and looked at the video footage, and saw Emma's son light something and throw it at our house towards our bedroom. Then an explosion shook the home. We called the police, but since there were no injuries or damage to the house, only burned up plants in the yard, they refused to even file a report. A few days later, we met with the realtor and moved away. So a little context to help the story start off. My parents got divorced when I was 10. I'm female, by the way. My brother was around 8 at that time as well. They had bought a house in a fairly big land and decided to split it. The house was demolished, and my mom was building a new house to live with me and my brother on that land. This all was in a very small city that was well known for its safety. Fast forward to when I was 15. I'm 25 now. The house still wasn't ready yet. Me, my brother, and my mom instead lived in an apartment really close to where they were building it, so we would check on the progress from time to time. This was an evening when my mom and I were getting back from the market and decided to go and check on the house. As we were parking in front of it, the car light shone on a man trying to jump the fence to get in. I was really freaked out, but my mom immediately stepped out of the car and began shouting at the man. "What the hell are you trying to do here?" It was an old guy, maybe in his late 60s or so. He was really tall, white, and skinny. He was starting to bald as well, having hair only on the sides of his head. Immediately, he just began to send out really creepy vibes. He jumped off of the fence and looked kind of scared, actually. He obviously wasn't expecting someone to show up, because nobody lived in that place yet. He told us that he lived in an apartment building next to the house, and he was trying to cut down a branch from a tree that was knocking on his window or something. My mom told him he was trespassing, and if he wanted anything to do in her house, he should have contacted her first. She yelled at him to go away and never come back. We went home after that and didn't really talk about it after. A few months later, though, my family finally moved into that completed house. It was very cute, with lots of trees and space for my dogs to run free. At that time, we had 3 of them, 2 small ones and a border collie we had rescued. Every day, we could hear a teenage female voice yelling at the apartment building next to our house. We figured out it was just some teenage drama. We could hear her saying things every teen would say to their parents at one point or another. You know, "I don't want to live here, you don't get me at all." We never really did anything about it because of this. Some time passed, and my friend moved to an apartment in that building as well. She said she could hear the teen yelling at the father all the time as well. Well, guess who the father was? Yeah, that man who had been trying to get inside our yard. This freaked me out a little bit, but I didn't have any proof he was actually doing something to the girl. One evening, I was eating some fruits in the front of my house with my dogs when I began to hear screaming, like a man and a woman were desperately fighting. I looked around and figured out it was coming from the building right next to my house. I looked up just in time to see a woman falling down from the balcony. I couldn't see if anyone had pushed her, though. I called the ambulance right away. They were very fast at getting there and taking her to the hospital as well. At the very same time, the police came and took away a man from that home. I couldn't really get a good look to see if it was the same man that had trespassed here. I didn't get to know what happened that day in the end, or who the man actually was. My dad started building his house next to my mom's. I spent a lot of time in my best friend's apartment that was just by that creeps. As I said, my yard was filled with trees, and sometimes we would see lots of animals there. Lizards, snakes, foxes, possums. This day, my friend and I were on her balcony, and we could see a lizard walking on the wall that separated my house from the building. Right on the balcony next to ours, the creepy man stepped out with a gun and began trying to snipe the lizard. We started screaming for him to stop and to not kill it. He looked very surprised. I guess he had thought he was alone. He didn't say a single thing. He just stared at us for a moment and then walked back inside his apartment. I told my dad about what happened, and he said I should never interact with that man from then on. I was already 18 at this point, and things had started to calm down, or so I thought. It was an afternoon around 1600, and I was home alone. I decided to go for a walk with my border collie. She was really sweet, and I used to ride my bike as she followed me running along. So that's what I was doing that day. As we were rounding the way back to my house, though, just passing by that building, that creepy man threw a huge rock at my dog. She was running, so it smacked her right in the leg. I cursed at him and walked back into my house, looking at my dog to see if she was hurt. I told my mom. She said I should never walk alone. Some days later, I found a really cute but skinny cat at my college. I was sitting down smoking, and it just sort of jumped into my lap. I carried him with me to my next class, and he slept on my lap through the whole thing. Eventually, I decided to take him back home with me. He was orange and quite fierce. As he was a street cat before, we let him go for walks in my street often. Everyone liked him. He was really friendly and asked for everyone to pet him. People let him into their houses, and frequently sent my mom pics of him doing cute things or sleeping on their sofas or whatever. So, we never thought he was bothering anyone by walking around. All this time, though, we had forgotten about the violent nature of our neighbor. My family went on a trip to visit my grandma, and my dad stayed behind to take care of our pets. He told us that one night he had heard some footsteps around his house, but as he walked out the front door, he couldn't see anyone. He thought it was just the dogs messing around at first, and went back inside to sleep. When we came back, we realized that one of the trees in my mom's house was suddenly dying. It was a really big tree, I think around 100 years old or so. This tree was the biggest one in the yard, and it was always so beautiful. I should also mention that this is the very same one that man had been complaining about the first time we'd met him. My dad went to look at that tree, and figured out that someone had bored a lot of holes in it. He said it was a way to get poison inside to kill it. He also told us we shouldn't tell my mom about this because it was going to really scare her and make her sad as well. The trees were the main reason to buy the place, so I never told her about it. Some more time passed by, and my brother and I moved out to another town to finish our studies. I wanted to take my cat with me, but my mom said it was going to be hard for him to adapt to living in an apartment. He liked so much to walk around after all, so I agreed that he would stay with her. A few days later, though, she visited me and told me that my cat had suddenly died. I was heartbroken. How did this happen? Well, she'd found him with his neck broken in front of the apartment building next to our house. His head was twisted, but he was still barely alive. By the time she arrived at the vet, the cat was already dead. She thinks it was that same man that killed him. We don't really have any proof, but you know that feeling when you just know that it's true? I cried so much, and just writing about it makes me cry as well. He was my very first cat, and he was so sweet. My mom still lives in the same house. She has 5 cats now, but none of them go out. That man also still lives next to her. I'm with her during quarantine, and I see him all the time. He always walks past our house, looking up to see if anyone's home. Also, about the girl from the balcony, I did find out eventually that she lived. She came back in a wheelchair, though. I don't know if it was permanent or not. She took all her things and moved away. I don't really know who pushed her, but my best friend that lived in the same building said the man was the only person there at the time. A few months after this as well, a lot of creepy things began to happen in our neighborhood, but I guess that's for another post. For a bit of context, I grew up in the middle of farmland in a large 1800s Victorian-style home. Given its long storied history, there had always been several shacks and barns that had once belonged to the builder of this home. There's a highway that sees maybe 3 cars on it during the night, and directly across from said highway, about 200 feet inward of a cornfield, is a shack I have always found very creepy. As kids, myself and my friends would dare each other to go inside and look, which pretty much always ended with us going as a team anyway. Nothing scary was ever found though. Maybe a few broken glasses here and there, some piles of metal and miscellaneous scrap items. There was no electricity or any sort of utility to make it homely at all. Years go by and the existence of this shack just became a part of my daily life. However, one particular night, as I was sat in my house watching TV, I noticed a light going off and on outside my window. After getting a bit startled, I dismissed it as simply passing cars, coming by a bit more frequently than they typically might have. An hour passed by though, it's nearing midnight, and the light stayed on. This time for sure, I knew it must be coming from something outside. My family was fast asleep, but being my pansy 16-year-old self, I needed some confirmation. Too bad for me though, no one wanted to go outside to check it out. I guess I was gonna have to go it alone. I grabbed my pocket knife and a flashlight, the best I could think of with my shaken thoughts, and took off into the night. As I neared the highway, the light immediately turned off, almost making me choke on the very air, but I had to figure out what the hell was going on here. I made it to the entrance of the shack, which had no door, and slowly began to enter, my flashlight scanning the room for any sign of life. What happened next, I will never forget. 5 feet away from me, there was an old tattered recliner, facing away. My father had tossed it in there a while back for future disposal. I shined my light on it, because I knew I'd just seen it rock ever so slightly. As I did that, a man stood up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I could tell was that he was middle-aged and wearing a jacket of sorts. Before I could even process what was happening, I was already sprinting across the road, hearing him following behind me. It felt like years before I could make it to my door, but as I was about to make it to safety, I decided to look back and see what was happening. The man was standing in the middle of the road, completely still, no words whatsoever. It's been 7 years since then. The shack still stands and the recliner remains in place as well. My dad never did believe me. I wish someone could share the dread I had when I realized the recliner was facing a window which directed straight to my house. This all started around December. I'm not sure if I should be contacting the police or anything like that, but it is quite unnerving. So I stay at my girlfriend's house on the weekends. She lives on campus at a university. She lives with 2 of her roommates and lives next door to her friends as well. This one particular night, I believe it was the 6th of December 2020, I remember being woken up very suddenly to screaming at 2 a.m. Now typically you'd expect any screams you heard on campus to be from people leaving the bars late at night. However, this was very different. There was this blood-curdling scream, and a girl yelling for her dad. She must have screamed out for him at least 4 different times. I really don't know how my girlfriend didn't wake up from this. It was so desperate. The last scream I heard for her dad was so sad and desperate. The kind of scream you'd make if you were really in trouble. It suddenly became very quiet. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest. At first, I thought it must be my girlfriend having a bad dream or something, but that scream had been all too real. The experience was definitely terrifying, but that wasn't the only time I had heard someone screaming. About 2 months later, the 3rd of February 2021, her neighbor texted her in a group chat to ask if she'd heard anyone screaming as well. And then, exactly a week later, another neighbor heard it too. Almost exactly another week goes by, and her friend who lives a couple streets down had roommates that had begun texting asking if she'd heard screaming at 2 a.m. too. At this point, we weren't really sure what to make of this. Perhaps some sort of luring for human trafficking or something. Less than a month later, on the 8th of March, around 11:30 p.m., we could hear a girl screaming, "Get off me!" We looked out the window, but we couldn't see anything happening around. That was the last time I know of that anyone heard this screaming. These events all seem very planned though, and the fact that my girlfriend lives with 2 other girls alone in a house without a deadlock makes this all seem very suspicious. I'll try to keep an eye out for next time I hear something and let you guys know. I'm kind of curious as to what this could be. I want to try and find the source of the screaming, just in case someone really does need help. If it happens, I'll make sure to document it as well. The weird thing is, she lives right next to a police department as well, so I really don't know what's going on here. I'm considering calling them about this very soon. Have any of you guys heard of something like this happening before, or perhaps something similar? So from 4th grade to the end of 5th roughly, I lived in this kinda shitty apartment building. It wasn't like drug dealers at my door shitty, but it definitely was not great. So one night, I'm laying there in bed listening to staticky country music from my old radio, trying to fall asleep, when I start to hear some loud banging from somewhere. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from at first, but then I realized it must be coming from the apartment above us. It sounded like someone was slamming on the floor. Much to my annoyance, I turned down my radio and started to listen a bit closer. I could hear the neighbor's little girl, who was about 6, crying and screaming. She kept on slamming on the floor. Out of tiredness and annoyance, I stood up on my bed and banged on the ceiling. She stopped after that. The next night, the same thing happened. I heard the banging, turned down my radio, and banged on the ceiling. This went on for 3 days before I began to communicate with this little girl through our banging on the floor and ceiling. On the 4th day, she didn't stop though. She kept banging and started crying and screaming. It was super late at night, so I don't think anyone else could hear. It was like someone was ripping a cat's fur out one by one. I banged on the ceiling to see if she was okay, and everything went silent for a second. I banged again, and after a few seconds she started screaming desperately. I heard this super loud bang, like someone just dropped a cinder block on the floor from 10 feet up. Everything went very quiet after that. I didn't see her or her mom ever again. I didn't even see them move out ever, but I do know that they were gone after this event. I don't know if there was something wrong with the family, like if the mom was abusive or something, but it was really weird. And I really hope that little girl was okay. I feel bad that I really couldn't find out what was going on. I should also add that this wasn't the only time that family had done weird stuff, or strange things had happened around them. The mom would kinda wander around aimlessly, and her kid would be left in the elevator alone. They were both just kind of a bit off. This happened a little bit ago, about a month or so I'd say, and it was a bizarre experience to say the very least. I'm 15 and I was playing some video games before passing out. It was about, I'd say, 11 p.m. when I suddenly heard the doorbell ring. Out of instinct, I began walking downstairs, but about halfway there, rationality came to my mind. Who the fuck rings a doorbell at 11 p.m.? I silently strode back up the stairs and stood in the hall, kind of expecting something bad to happen. An exact minute later, it rung twice once more. My parents began to leave their room and gave me a quizzical look. All I had to respond with, though, was a shrug. The person at the door started to bang on it. My mother jumped at the first bang, and my father's eyes widened, more in confusion than fear though. He decided to go downstairs and peep through the view hole and see what was going on. It seemed it was our neighbor. My dad very hesitantly opened the door, and I could hear my father's voice tremble slightly. "Hey, what's wrong? What do you need?" The next thing I hear is a full-blown scream from our neighbor, claiming that this household was his, and we'd stolen it from him. My father's uneasiness was quickly replaced with annoyance, and he simply shut the door in their face without giving our neighbor the time of day. My dad had just stepped on the first step going up the stairwell when our neighbor began to attack the front door. I'm not talking about just banging with a fist. This man was full body slamming it. My father was stunned for a second. My neighbor charged the door again. This time we heard the splintering of wood. Everyone reacted at once. My father went to brace the door with his body. My mom went to get the other two kids, and I went straight for 911. The slamming and attacking of the door ensued for another 5 minutes while I was on the phone with 911. Suddenly, it stopped. I thought it was over, and I was very relieved, but I was still stuck on the phone. I went to peek out the front window of my house, though, and boy, was it only just getting started. Our neighbor had went to retrieve his Jeep Wrangler and was now running the engine, pointing it straight at our house. We had zero clue what he was going to do, until he slammed the gas and we heard the squealing of tires. Then he immediately slammed on the brakes. It seemed he was trying to scare us out of our home. Still on the phone with the police, I stepped away from the window to comfort my siblings, crack jokes, and try and make everyone feel better. Eventually, the police did arrive, pulled him out of the car, and arrested him. The next morning, I left for school, still shaken from the night before. I stepped onto our front steps and could see tire marks leading all the way up to our front door. The lunatic had actually tried to drive up our steps and ram our door down with his car. I never want to see this dumb cunt ever again, but unfortunately he lives directly to my right. Fuck my life.